Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome you to our special training, the 5 most frustrating mistakes that keep graduate students stuck in grad school for an extra 2 years. My name is Dora Farkas, and I'm really honored to be here with you today. We're going to get started momentarily. So if you can hear me well, please say hello in the chat box, just so that I know that the technology is working. If you cannot see my screen, or if at any time during the presentation you can't hear my voice, just please press the blue reconnect button, and that should get you right back into the webinar. So all right, I can see that a lot of people are here on the line. So I would like to thank Anne. I think I saw you here in the chat box. I would like to thank Anne for inviting me so I can give this training for everybody at Ohio State University. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm really honored that so many of you have registered for this training and decided to spend this hour with me. And I will make sure that your time is used well. I'm going to have a presentation, and there will also be opportunity for you to ask questions. I have some built-in Q&A breaks here. So I am going to get started right away. So my name is Dora Farkas. I am the founder of the online Finish Your Thesis community. I am a thesis and career coach, and I'm the creator of the online Finish Your Thesis program, and also a new program called the Writing Accelerator Bootcamp. And before I get started, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself. I got my bachelor's in chemical engineering and my PhD in biological engineering, both from MIT. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for several years as a senior scientist. I've been a thesis and career coach since 2009, and I've been working with hundreds, maybe even thousands of graduate students since then, live programs, online group coaching sessions, and also private one-on-one coaching. So just in case whether you're wondering whether this is the right training for you, you are in the right place if you want to break out of the burnout and procrastination cycle, if you want to be more productive, if you want to feel more confident about your work, and if you really are committed to getting your thesis done. If any of these apply to you, then you've definitely come to the right place. So I wanted to begin by giving you a little bit of my story from graduate school, because many people ask me, how did I end up becoming a thesis coach and doing what I do? And this will really put this training into context for you. So when I was a graduate student at MIT, I had a really challenging thesis topic. It was a very new topic, and after 5 years, I had no publishable data. And I was under so much stress that I developed a chronic inflammatory condition in my arms, which really limited my ability to work. Most of the time, I could only work 1 to 2 hours a day, which, as you know, as a grad student is really not enough. And I thought that there was no way to graduate. And the problem was that the more I tried to work, either by typing or lab work, the more severe my condition was. So I had to find a way to be more productive without working more hours. And so in the beginning of my 6th year, which I hoped would be my last year because that was the average time for graduation in my department, I really decided to change things because I knew that my current method of working was only making my condition worse, and it wasn't getting my thesis anywhere either. So I talked with my supervisor. I got really clear about my thesis goals. More importantly, I restructured my time at work. I eliminated a lot of time sinks. And as you will see in today's presentation, many of the things that we do are just busy work. They're really not moving the needle when it comes to your thesis. So I really began to focus on what are the things that make a difference for my thesis. So I developed a new writing process, and even though I could only work a little bit every day, I committed to taking action every day towards my thesis. And this really paid off because in 9 months, I collected enough data for my thesis. I wrote and defended my thesis on time. I just barely made the graduation deadline, but that was okay because I was able to graduate at the end of my 6th year. And even more exciting, I had 3 first author publications in preparation, which at the beginning of my 6th year, I didn't, was almost unthinkable. So these small changes in your work habits that I will present to you today can really make a huge difference in your productivity and in the progress that you make in your thesis. So today I will share these strategies with you as well so that you can reduce your stress, your overwhelm. You can feel more confident, you can make consistent, tangible progress, and you can get your thesis done. So I divided the presentation into 2 parts. Part 1 is about the 5 most frustrating mistakes that keep students stuck in grad school for an extra 2 years. Then I will have a Q&A break. And in part 2, I will share with you my top 3 favorite strategies that can double your productivity without working more hours. And I also have a free resource for you. In fact, I was thinking that just in case some of you may need to leave early, I am going to put up the free resource right now. So if you look on the right side of your screen, you will see a picture of my free ebook called Finish Your Thesis Faster. And just click the orange button to download. If you cannot see the link, then actually I'm just going to type it in quickly into the chat box. So it's just finishyourthesis.com/ebook. So I highly recommend that you stay for the entire presentation because not everything that I will present here is in my ebook. But if you do need to leave early, at least this will help you to download the book. Okay, so let's get started with the 5 most frustrating mistakes that keep you stuck. And feeling stuck in grad school is one of the worst feelings because there really is, it feels like there's really nothing that you can do. Sometimes it can feel like that. But if you know what these mistakes are in advance, you can prevent them. So I'm going to list the 5 mistakes first. I'm going to discuss them in detail, and then I will show you some strategies to prevent these mistakes. So the 5 mistakes are: first, getting caught in the cycle of procrastination and burnout. Second, trying to do groundbreaking research. Number 3, assuming that more hours lead to more progress. Number 4, focusing on getting through your to-do list. 5, multitasking to be more productive. And if you look at these 5 mistakes, other than number 1, the other ones kind of seem like good things to do, right? Like spending a lot of time on your work, getting through your to-do list, multitasking. On the surface, these all seem like good things, but they're actually really counterproductive, as I will show you. So let's begin with the first mistake, which is getting caught in the cycle of procrastination and burnout. And this is really important because this is one of those cycles that you can fall into without realizing it until it is too late. So I'm going to read some statements to you and see if you can identify with any of them. So you are working really hard but not making progress. You make plans, but you can't seem to follow through. You feel unmotivated and frustrated, specifically about your thesis. You always feel like you should be further along when it comes to your research, and you keep getting distracted by unimportant things, also known as procrastination. So definitely I could relate to many of these as a grad student, and it's one thing to be aware of them, but it's another thing to know what to do about it. It's easy to say, I want to stop procrastinating, I want to stop feeling burned out, but how do you actually do that? So if you can identify with any of the statements before, you're probably caught in some type of burnout procrastination cycle. So now I'm going to show you how you actually get caught in this cycle. And it really begins by setting an ambitious goal. And again, on the surface, that seems like a good thing, right? Setting an ambitious goal, trying to impress your supervisor, trying to do novel research. On the surface, it seems like a good thing. The problem is that many graduate students are really high achievers, especially if you have some type of imposter syndrome, then you may even try to prove yourself even harder. So perhaps you set an ambitious goal that's unrealistic, and then you work long hours until you burn out. And that's what leads to procrastination. It's not some personality flaw. Many times it's just simple exhaustion. So you start procrastinating, you fall behind on your goals. And then when you recover your energy, then you're like, okay, now I'm really going to get started on that project, on that paper. So now that you're a little bit behind, your goal may be even more ambitious. Perhaps the goal is the same, but now you have less time to do it. So it seems more ambitious. So now you work even longer hours, you burn out even faster, you start procrastinating again, and then you fall behind on your goals again. And each time you go through this cycle, you get more and more exhausted, more and more frustrated, and you don't know what you're doing wrong because you set your goals, you work hard, and then things just don't work out. So this is the cycle of procrastination and burnout. Now you can break out of this cycle. So to break out of the cycle of burnout, you need to let go of the myths and mistakes that got you into this cycle in the first place. So the rest of this first part of the presentation is actually going to be discussing the myths that are on the surface, seem like they're good habits, but in fact, it is these mistakes number 2 through 5, that get you into cycle of procrastination and burnout. So mistake number 2 is to try to do groundbreaking research. Now, why is this a mistake? So again, on the surface, it sounds like trying to do something novel. It would be really good for your career. But actually doing really groundbreaking research is more the exception, not the rule when it comes to a PhD thesis. So maybe you've heard of Victor de Broglie. He was a French physicist who earned his PhD in 1923 at Sorbonne University. So why do I talk about him? He's a physicist. And so the reason that I talk about him is that he's one of the really few people, maybe the only person, who won a Nobel Prize for his PhD thesis, which was on the wave-particle duality. So even though many students, when they enter grad school, they are really ambitious and they hope to do something super significant, expecting yourself to do really novel research can really put some unnecessary pressure on yourself, because doing really groundbreaking research is the exception, not the rule. And it's not even expected in graduate school. So this is the mistake number 2, that thinking that you must do groundbreaking research. And the reason that many students make this mistake is that just by nature, as academics, we're very ambitious and we put these unrealistically high expectations on ourselves. And if you don't put them on yourself, perhaps you're in a ultra competitive environment. So even if you come to grad school without these expectations, perhaps you get them from all the people around you. But in fact, the goal of graduate school is to learn how to do research independently, not to do groundbreaking research, but to learn how to become an independent researcher. So it is much more important to focus on meeting the requirements of your thesis committee, which are the requirements for you to finish your thesis, rather than doing something that's really groundbreaking, because your ticket out of graduate school is a written thesis. So you need to put your focus on what your committee expects from you. And that can actually really simplify your life. So I interviewed many PhDs, including professors, when I was creating my course. And one of the professors at MIT, who was a tenured professor, I think probably for 30, maybe even more years. So he had quite a number of grad students graduate from his lab. And what he said was that my students usually think they need to do more than they actually have to. And even though he was a very accomplished professor, he found that his students had unrealistically high expectations from themselves. So what are the consequences of having unrealistically high expectations from yourself? So one of the consequences is having perfectionism. And it's interesting that when I do webinars for graduate students, almost always I get this question of, what do I do about my perfectionist tendencies? I know I'm a perfectionist, but I don't know what to do about it. It helps a little bit if you know what the root cause of the perfectionism is, because perfectionism actually served you well to get you to where you are now. Because in order to get to graduate school, first you had to make it into college. And to make it into college, you had to get perfect scores on your exams, on your SATs, on your GREs. And so all of these achievements got you into graduate school. But once you're in graduate school, your goal is really to strive for excellence and not perfection. And perfectionism can actually paralyze you during the writing process. So when it comes to writing your thesis, what I recommend is to let go of your thesis when you feel that it's 95 to 98% there. When you're just making those final little touches at the end, those micro adjustments, those are really perfectionist things. That's the time when you can let your thesis go and send it to your committee, because they're going to give you more revisions to do anyway. So no matter how long you work on your thesis, you will need to add revisions. So when you feel you're 95 to 98% there, that's a good time to send it to your committee for their feedback. Another consequence of having really unrealistic high expectations from yourself is that you beat yourself up for failing again. And that's because your definition of failing, the definition of failing is different for everyone. And as grad students, we have very high expectations. So when you beat yourself up for not meeting those really high expectations, you lose your motivation, you lose your confidence, focus, creativity. That's when you get into the burnout and procrastination cycle, and all of these things add up to being less productive overall. So the way to overcome this mistake of trying to have these ultra high expectations from yourself is to be very clear on the scope and the requirements of your thesis, to plan realistically and take the pressure off from yourself. And I know that this is much easier said than done, because the scope and the requirements for a thesis keep changing. I know that. The requirements for my thesis kept changing as well. However, it is so important to have the conversation open with your committee and your supervisor, so that at least at any point in time, you're fairly clear on what those requirements are and you work towards them, even if they have to change. So having said that, let me just take a quick look at the chat box here. I'm going to take a quick water break. I want to make sure that the technology is working. Just want to check in with people. Okay, so I see that some people just joined the webinar here. Welcome. We're just getting to mistake number 3. If you missed it, don't worry, there is going to be a replay available, but I highly recommend that you stay for the open Q&A session. Okay, so getting back to these mistakes. So just to summarize what I've said so far, the first mistake that can keep you stuck in grad school is if you're caught in the cycle of procrastination and burnout, because each time you get caught in that cycle, it just leads to more and more exhaustion and you're less motivated. You have less confidence to finish your thesis. The second mistake is having these really high expectations from yourself to do groundbreaking research instead of focusing on the requirements of your committee and your supervisor. Mistake number 3 is assuming that more hours lead to more progress. This is a really dangerous mistake. I know that some students feel like they have to be at work just for the sake of being at work. And I know that some thesis supervisors actually expect you to be at work just for the sake of being at work. However, at least if you know for yourself that more hours don't necessarily lead to more progress, then at least for the time that you do have control over, you're able to structure that time better. So I want to ask you whether you've ever had a day that looked something like this. So let's say you get to work around 9 a.m. You check your email, spend a little time prioritizing your tasks, maybe 15 minutes. And then before you get started with your work, you do a quick check in Facebook just to check in with people, see if there are any important news you should know about. So then you're off of Facebook by 9:30, and then you try to get started on your work, but then you have this creativity block and you're just wondering what to do about it. So then you may get a coffee or cookie or something to increase your blood sugar. So then you have this short bout of incredible productivity from either caffeine or sugar high. So you work really effectively for 30 minutes to an hour, and then you stare blankly at your project. And then it's almost lunchtime. So you go for lunch, you come back, you check your email, and the cycle starts all over again. So the interesting thing is that even though this cycle is ineffective, when you look at it as an outsider, when you look at it, you can see that this is an ineffective cycle. Many people actually operate this way without realizing it. And so, as you can see, spending many hours at work does not automatically lead to more progress. It is much more important how you spend those hours. So when you work overtime on a regular basis, it can really lead to lack of focus, exhaustion, frustration, loss of motivation, confusion, and just overall burnout. And I'm sure you've all heard this before, but common sense is not necessarily common practice. So even though you might realize that you're working too many hours and you're feeling exhausted all the time and you should cut back on those hours, you may not know how to do that. Because again, that's one of those things that's easier said than done. So how do you break out of this procrastination and burnout cycle? What is the alternative to working lots of hours? So the alternative to working lots of hours is to put structure into your day. When you put structure into your day, not only are you going to make more progress, but that progress is actually going to be tangible and measurable. So at the end of the day, if somebody asks you, so what did you get done today? You will actually have something to show for your time. And that can give you this sense of accomplishment that you can be really proud of because you actually got some really important things done during the day. So in order to develop a daily structure, focus on the specific results you want to achieve, not the work hours. And this is really a big shift for many students, because when I work with students and I ask them, what's your goal for the week? Many of them will give me an answer such as, well, I just want to work on my thesis every day, or I want to spend at least 10 hours on my writing. But if you think about it, 10 hours isn't a result. That's actually what you want, is not to get 10 hours of writing done. What you really want is to have a chapter done from your thesis that you could send to your supervisor, or a really good first draft that you can edit the following week. So thinking about tangible results instead of number of hours that you want to work is a really big shift in your thinking. So this leads us to mistake number 4, where I'm going to discuss, focusing on getting through your to-do list. And again, the habit of putting a lot of effort on checking off the items on your to-do list on the surface seems like a really good habit. But in graduate school, which is so unfocused, well, not unfocused, I'm sorry, with graduate school, which is so unstructured and where you have to be your own boss, if you operate from a to-do list, that's not really going to get you to a graduate level thesis. So my question to students is, do you ever complete everything on your to-do list? And most people tell me no. I actually never met anybody who said that they completed everything on their to-do list. So it's a to-do list. Usually you don't complete everything on it. So that automatically leads to a bit of feeling like, well, you're not accomplishing as much as you'd like to. So most people don't get through their to-do list because it is just a collection of tasks without structure. And your to-do list probably has items that are related to your research, your writing, some administrative tasks, maybe things that you have to do for your health, for your family, for your finances. So it's a collection of random tasks. There is no structure. You have to keep shifting your focus from one area to another. I mean, just talking about it makes me feel exhausted. So trying to get through a collection of items on a to-do list is not only exhausting, it's actually a very ineffective way of operating. But that's the only way that people know how to operate, unless they're taught a different way. Unless you intentionally put structure into your day, you're just automatically going to react to the demands of your supervisor, the demands of the people around you, which will end up being an unorganized to-do list. That's not how you want to operate. Because when you have a to-do list, it just leads to feeling busy all the time. Did you ever notice that whenever you meet some people, maybe they're really successful and you ask them how they're doing, they will say, I'm doing really good, really busy. It's almost as if being busy is synonymous with being successful, which I find really interesting because I don't think the two are synonymous, but in our culture, they are. So this is what happens when you're always busy. And I created this flow chart for you so that you can see how this habit of focusing on trying to get through your to-do list ends up being counterproductive. And this is what many of us do just simply because of the influences from our environment, our culture. So let's just start with the first thing here. So the first thing that people do as a consequence of having this mindset of always trying to keep yourself busy because you think busy leads to success is to do what some people call majoring in the minor things. So you may be really good at replying to emails on time, to being active on social media, to volunteering your time to social events. So when you think about your thesis, these are really minor things because your committee is not going to accept your thesis based on how quickly you respond to emails. But these are easy things to do. This is an easy way to keep yourself busy and to make yourself feel like you are getting through things. But the problem is that when you major in the minor things, you have little time and energy left for the high priorities. Maybe by the time you get to reading those journal articles or to writing part of your thesis, you're feeling really drained. And writing is the last thing you want to do because you're just so exhausted from doing all of the busy work. And so what that leads to is falling behind on your goals. This may lead to conflicts with your supervisor who's wondering why you're not making progress. And again, this leads to this feeling of guilt for lack of progress. You're not sure why you're not making progress when you're keeping yourself busy all the time. You are working all the time. And so when you get some of your energy back, let's say you come to work the next day feeling all energized, the automatic thing then is to just major in the minor things again, to get caught up in the email, the busy work, the demands of others. And again, this is another cycle. This is the busy cycle, which is very similar to the burnout and procrastination cycle on a smaller scale because it doesn't necessarily lead to a burnout. However, it does keep you very busy without making any progress. And that can be very frustrating. Oops. Just trying to get through. Okay, so what can you do to break out of the busyness cycle and make some real tangible progress? Something to show your committee, your supervisor, something that you can be really proud of. So in order to make tangible progress, you need to shift from this busyness mindset to a results-based mindset. And again, this is not an easy thing to do because we live in a world where where you're expected to be busy all the time. But in order to shift to a results-based mindset, you need to let go of this belief that busyness leads to more progress and to replace that with a question. So instead of coming to work each day and thinking, okay, what do I have to do today? That's a busyness. What do I have to do today? Replace that with a question. What are the results that I need to achieve today? And by results, I mean things that are tangible, that really move the needle towards getting your thesis done. So here are some examples of the results. Here are some examples of questions that you can ask yourself to help you to determine the most important results that will help you to get to your finished thesis. So, for example, if you're just starting to shift into a results-based mindset, you may want to ask yourself a question such as, what is the next most important step in your thesis? What is the next thing that you have to do? And where do you want to be in 1 week? What is it that you would like to tell your supervisor that you've accomplished? And what are the results that your supervisor expects from you in a week or in a month? I mean, do you know what the expectations are? And what are your priorities each day? What is your highest priority? And that's an interesting question, because you may know what your highest priority is, but unless you're intentional about it, you may not get to it until later in the day, and maybe an emergency will pop up and you will not get to it. And then to ask yourself, can you eliminate any busyness such as email and social media? For those of you who are not here at the beginning of this training, I mentioned that due to a medical condition, I had to seriously eliminate a lot of the busy work that I was doing, a lot of the email that I was doing, a lot of responding to demands from people, a lot of these time sinks I just had to eliminate by necessity. And it was just amazing how these small changes really skyrocketed my productivity, even though I was only able to work a limited number of hours because of a medical condition. So before we get to our Q&A break and the second half of our training today, I want to talk about the fifth most frustrating mistake, which is multitasking to be productive. And again, this seems like a good thing, right? Multitasking, you're getting a lot of things done. Students who are parents, I know that maybe you cannot avoid multitasking. I'm a parent myself, so I know that sometimes it's impossible to not multitask. But hopefully when you're at work, you are able to restructure your time. So I like to ask students when I go to live events, I like to ask how many people here think that they're good at multitasking. And usually maybe a third, maybe even a half of the people raise their hands. They think that they're really good at multitasking. And then I do this exercise with them where I ask them to write letters and numbers first in sequence and then alternating between letters and numbers. And not only is the multitasking take longer, but it's actually really exhausting. And they're only doing it for about 30 seconds. So this really simple exercise really helps people to see how multitasking is not only ineffective, but it is exhausting. So one way to measure whether you're good at multitasking is to assess how you feel at the end of the day. So if you've been doing a bit of multitasking, which can be as simple as, let's say you're working on something on your computer, but you get a ping each time that you get an email, you get some kind of notification for email or text message, and you quickly check the email or text message, that's actually multitasking. You're switching back and forth. You know, that's just that context switching is very exhausting for your brain. So if you're doing that and at the end of your day, you're feeling distracted, exhausted, really tense and frustrated that you didn't get a lot more done, it could be because you were either intentionally or unintentionally doing multitasking. So if it's true for you that you're doing some multitasking, but you're feeling super exhausted at the end of the day, then perhaps multitasking isn't working for you so well. And according to some research in neuroscience, most people can't really multitask. They're actually switching between task A and task B. Some people claim that they do multitask well. However, the research doesn't really support that. And in fact, you do work much better when you focus on one task at a time. So as I mentioned before, when you think you're multitasking, such as you're reading your email or your text messages while being in a meeting, you're not really listening to the presentation and checking your emails at the same time. You are really switching back and forth. And this, in the long run, leads to reduced performance, fatigue, and tasks taking a lot longer than they really should. And what's really interesting is that multitaskers usually overestimate how long it takes to do a task. And the reason that they overestimate it is that when you're multitasking, you're not nearly as efficient. So if you weren't multitasking, that task would take you half as long to do. But because your brain is exhausted from multitasking, it's not performing quite as well. So things may take you twice or 3 times as long. So instead of multitasking, what's the alternative to it? So sometimes students will tell me, well, I can't really avoid multitasking because I get interrupted all the time. So one alternative is to set your timer to some short blocks of time when you're quite confident that you won't be interrupted, or at least you're doing your best to not be interrupted. Maybe you go to the library or a cafe, you work at home for a short amount of time when you can focus on one task only. And sometimes for students who are actively writing their thesis while collecting data at the same time, just doing half an hour of focused writing a day when they're not being interrupted can make a really, really big difference in the quality of their writing and how they feel about the progress that they're making on their writing. So what I recommend is to set your timer to whatever length of time you can, somewhere between 10 to 45 minutes at a time, and to really put your focus on one task only, whether it's writing, reading, or experiments. Turn off all the distractions and notifications. If you do want to listen to some music, typically meditation music or some acoustical music without words typically is the best type of background music. So I usually ask students what they notice after they try single tasking. Just 1 or 2 times they try writing, maybe first thing in the morning before they get distracted. And usually they're really surprised that something that they thought would take a long time to write, they actually get it done pretty quickly. They're able to concentrate a lot better. They're more creative. They get a lot more ideas. They feel more motivated and they have more energy. And I've done quite a bit of writing myself, and I noticed such a huge difference. It's the level of clarity that you have, or the quality of the clarity that you have when you write, when you're not being interrupted. It is really quite amazing. So if you are writing your thesis at the moment, I highly recommend that you somehow arrange your schedule so that you have a block of time when you can really just single task and focus on your thesis and turn off all other distractions. And you may be really, I think you'll probably be really amazed at how much more effective you will be. And instead of feeling drained at the end of your writing, you might feel actually energized and confident about your performance. So it can take some time to let go of multitasking because it's a habit. If you've been multitasking in any way, whether it's checking email while writing or checking your text when listening to a presentation, it can take some time to let go of that habit. So be patient with yourself. But when you do get into the habit of at least doing single tasking once a day for a short period of time, I think you will really be happy with the results. So I'm going to take a quick water break here, and I'm going to look at the chat box. And I'm just going to see if anybody has any questions. So let me just check the webinar room here. Okay, so we have a lot of people here at the training, and I just wanted to check in with you whether any of the mistakes that I mentioned earlier, whether any of them resonate with you. If you have any questions, if you don't have any questions at the moment, you can certainly type them into the chat box as I go through the rest of this training. I'm going to be talking about my 3 favorite strategies that will help you to double your productivity. I see a comment here from Gary. So Gary says that you can relate to all of the mistakes. So Gary, that's a really great point. So what do you do if you can relate to all of the mistakes? It's really difficult to shift 5 habits at the same time. So what I would do, and actually maybe I will go back to that slide here where I list all 5 mistakes. I'm really glad that I get this feedback that you can resonate with all 5 of these mistakes. So if all 5 of these mistakes resonate with you, then probably what I would start with is with getting rid of mistake number 4, where instead of focusing on getting through your to-do list, you think about, what are the results that I want to achieve today? And just take it one day at a time. Maybe starting with tomorrow, think about, okay, what would I like to accomplish by the end of tomorrow? And what are the things that I need to do in order to accomplish that result? So that's what I would start with. That's what will really help you to start shifting how you structure your day. And that automatically may help you to become more productive without having to work overtime, because you're going to realize how many things you do that are really not very effective. So that's what I would start with, is to focus on what are the specific results that you like to accomplish. Okay, Carrie says she can relate to all of them as well. Okay, Mariana says, how do you know what is a realistic goal? So the way that what you know is a realistic goal is just by experience. So for example, if you're doing writing, well, what's a realistic goal? If you know that, let's say you start writing for an hour, I highly recommend that if you do that, you measure the number of words that you write, because that's really specific to your topic, your field, your style of writing. And so if you notice that in 1 hour you write about 500 words, you know that's a good ballpark estimate for the future. So realistic goal really depends on your past experience. And I would say to set a goal that you're fairly comfortable with, that you know you've achieved in the past. So I hope that's a good start. Zainab, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm usually not very ambitious, but I find myself failing to meet the expectations of my supervisor and the thesis committee. How can I get out of this feeling of being constantly behind? So what I would do is to create a timeline. So when you say that you're failing to meet the expectations, I'm assuming that they've set a goal for you to get done by a certain time. So what I would do, if you think that it's unrealistic for you, I would just create the timeline. And if you keep missing those deadlines, is to really think about, okay, why am I missing these goals here? Why am I not reaching them? And sometimes supervisors set unrealistic goals, not because they're trying to burn you out on purpose, but simply because they don't know how long it takes to do something. Maybe they've never done this type of research before. They've been out of the lab or out of the thesis writing experience for a long time. So I would sit down with your supervisor and your committee and really discuss why you're not meeting these expectations. And many times you can negotiate something, either simplifying it or extending the deadline, or ask them what they recommend. If it's not humanly possible for you to meet those expectations, then see if you can come up with an alternative solution. Anne says, what if supervisors expect immediate email responses? What would be a good plan to handle this but not be multitasking? This is a great question. So I've had actually a couple of students who were in this situation where it was their supervisors who were expecting immediate email responses. And what they did was that they trained their eyes to just scan their email, just the sender, just as not necessarily the subject line, but just the sender, and just to see if there's anything from their supervisor, and to only respond to that. And I know that takes a lot of willpower, but if you really committed to getting stuff done, and if you're under a deadline, it's much easier to do. So that's what I would recommend, is just to train your eyes to scan your email to see if there's anything from just your thesis supervisor, and everything else can probably wait. Jonathan says, how do you combat the guilt that accompanies taking some time to get personal things done other than research classes, lack of progress done? Okay, so I guess what you're asking is, how do you deal with the guilt? Okay, I see. How do you deal with the guilt of falling behind because you got some personal things done? So the way that I coped with this when I was a grad student is that I just grouped many of those things together as well as I could. So in the mid-afternoon, I usually wasn't very productive. That's true for many people. It was really true for me. So mid-afternoon would be the time when I would schedule making all the calls, ordering reagents. I was in the experimental sciences. So all of the administrative things that don't require a lot of concentration, I would get those done in the mid-afternoon if you can. Some of those things you may not be able to get done at the same time, but at least maybe you can group them together as much as you can. So that's how I would combat some of the guilt, because at least you're minimizing, how much you fall behind. Gregory says, hi, Dora. I had a question about making results-oriented goals. You mentioned one of our goals is to learn how to do research. I see part of that as thinking of novel research questions. How do you break down open-ended goals into concrete tasks? Let me see if I understand your question. So, novel research questions. So I think that this question is really something where you have to think about what are the options for your research with your thesis supervisor. And I really like that you put down open-ended goals into your question here, because many times it's good to have an open question for your research goals, like how does this happen, instead of a yes or no question for your thesis. So I think that this really just comes down to the science itself, to talking with your supervisor, doing your literature search, and just thinking about how have other people done this type of research, what were some of the intermediary steps that they took. And it also helps to think, what would I like to get done in a month? What would I like to get done in a week? And that really helps you to think about concrete tasks. When you think about just the 1 week ahead, you can plan a lot more realistically. So I hope it helps, this answer. It does come down to getting very specific with your supervisor about your thesis specifically. Okay, so again, if you have more questions, please put them in the chat box. We'll have another Q&A break at the end here. But in the meantime, I'm going to share with you my 3 favorite strategies to double your productivity. So first one is to consciously build structure into your day. Number 2 is to prioritize strategically. And number 3, park downhill at the end of the day. And no, I'm not referring to your car. It's just a metaphor that I use, and it'll make sense to you by the end of this presentation. Okay, so the first strategy is to consciously build structure into your day. So, I'm just make sure that the slides are, okay, okay. So graduate school by nature is an unstructured environment. Usually it's unstructured. And unless you have a micromanager, supervisor, nobody tells you when to start and stop working. No one tells you specifically what you need to get done each day. That's why some of you had those questions about what's concrete, what's realistic, because nobody really tells you what to get done by the end of the day. You don't know when your work is good enough, and you don't necessarily know what you need to do to finish your thesis. And so when you have too much or unstructured time, your goals become vague, perhaps they're too broad, maybe they're unrealistic, and you overestimate how much you can get done. If any of you ever had, quote unquote, the whole day to get work done, you may have experienced that you overestimated how much you can get done in one day. And what happens when you have a lot of unstructured time and vague goals is that hours, days, weeks can go by without any measurable progress. And this is what leads to the feeling of frustration, hopelessness, feeling lost, not knowing what the next step is. And many students think that the answer is to work more hours, read more articles, and they work to the point of exhaustion or burnout, and then you get caught in the burnout procrastination cycle. Because as I mentioned earlier, in case you missed the beginning, is that many times procrastination is simply because you are exhausted. It's not a personality flaw. You may just be exhausted. So here are some ways to structure your day effectively. So plan breaks in advance. And I know that this may seem silly, but it works really well to put everything into your calendar. So put in what time you're going to do your meals, your exercise, your fun time. And again, I know that that sounds crazy, but when you decide in advance what are the hours that you will schedule your exercise, your fun time, your meals, your sleep, that's when you realize that you really don't have that much time to work. So even if you have, quote unquote, the whole day to work, once you factor in all the other things that you need to do, you don't have that many hours to do your work. And that's what's going to give you a little bit of a wake-up call that you do need to structure the remaining hours very effectively. So put structure into your day proactively to avoid reacting to your environment and working overtime. Unless you're proactive about it, what's going to happen is that you come to work in the morning, you open your email, and suddenly you're going to see something of an emergency from somebody else, and you're going to end up working on that instead of your own. Obviously, if it's from your thesis supervisor, that's a different story, but I'm sure many of you have experienced getting drawn into somebody else's emergency that wasn't really an emergency. So it is really important that you consciously build structure into your day and really block out time for everything that's important. You've probably heard that if you want exercise to happen, you got to schedule it. Otherwise, you'll miss it. It's true for many of the other things. Number 2 is to prioritize strategically. Now, what do I mean by that? So there's a saying, I worked in industry for a few years, and there was a saying that if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. And in industry where you're working on multiple projects at the same time, this was a really important saying because you really had to decide which of your projects was a priority at that time. So you need to make a conscious decision of what's the priority or what are your priorities today. And the recommendation, and this comes from neuroscience, is to set no more than 3 priorities for each day. So what's the scope of a priority? So what I mean by a priority is not necessarily one action, such as, write the abstract to a paper, but more a project. So the scope of a priority would be writing this manuscript or analyzing the data or running an experiment. So those are the priorities, they're projects. And the recommendation is to set 1 to 3 priorities per day for optimal productivity. Because when you have more than 3 priorities, that's what really leads to overwhelm. And I know a lot of students struggle with that because everything seems like a priority and you may have 5 priorities. But if you're listening to this webinar, my guess is that you're feeling frustrated by how much you're getting done, the progress that you're making. So you know that you need to try something new. And when you really make a conscious decision about what is a real priority and what is not, that's when you can really start to make tangible progress in that one area. So for each priority, list all the actions that will help you to move your project forward. So, for example, if your priority is to finish a manuscript, then the actions that will help you to move this project forward would be editing part of a manuscript, doing the literature review for your introduction, and then to send an email to your supervisor to ask to schedule a meeting. So for each of your projects, think of 1 to 5 actions that will move that project forward. And on some days, you may only have one priority. Like, for example, the manuscript, the 3 actions that I listed here, I think they could take up your whole day. So just think about it as up to 3 priorities per day. And for each of them, think about 1 to 5 actions. So if you have any questions about that, please put that in the chat box. I know that's the area where students have a lot of questions about prioritization, what's realistic, how do you decide, what's a project? So put those questions in the chat box. I'm going to wrap up with this final strategy, park downhill at the end of the day. And like I said, it's not referring to your car here. But many times when I work with students, I ask, do you ever feel overwhelmed and don't know where to start a project? See, many times this feeling of overwhelm isn't necessarily because you have so much to do. The confusion really comes from, where do I start? What's the first step that I need to take? Because it is really hard to pick up momentum if you don't know where to start. So to set yourself up for success, there's a strategy that I recommend that I call parking downhill. And the reason for this metaphor is that let's say that the roads are icy and you park your car uphill. It's going to be really hard in the morning to get that car going because gravity is working against you. If instead you park your car downhill, then starting it up the next day is going to be much easier because gravity is working for you. So how do you implement this idea when you're working on your thesis? So the way that you implement it is that you set yourself up for success the evening before. Instead of coming in the morning and then deciding what are my priorities today, you already know in the morning what you need to start working on. So end your day by defining your priorities the evening before. Get everything ready. So if you're doing writing, get your list of references out, perhaps do a setup for the experiments if you're in the experimental sciences, and know exactly where you will start working the next day. So determine the number 1 priority that must get done. So when you come in at 9 a.m. or 8:30 or whenever you come in, if you want to be really productive, if you want to have a really structured day, it is really useful if you know exactly what's the first step that you will take, because once you take that first step, you will pick up momentum. So it is really just a matter of knowing where to start. And the best way to do that is to decide that a day in advance, because that's when you can really get some perspective on it. So to summarize, when your priorities are clear and you have structure, it is easier to make progress on the things that actually matter, the things that are actually moving your thesis forward. So we're almost at the top of the hour. And as I said before, you can download my free ebook at finishyourthesis.com/ebook. And taking a quick water break here. I will hang out for a couple of more minutes just in case anybody has any questions. So please put them in the chat box. So this ebook that you can download, it's Finish Your Thesis Faster, How to Manage Your Time and Be More Productive in Graduate School. I think I have about 30 strategies listed in there. Some of them you may have seen in the presentation today, but I also have some other ones. So I have the 10 most common career-destroying mistakes that students commit without even realizing it. I also included a 3-step formula to get your thesis supervisor and committee members on your side. It's always a really good thing. You want to make sure that you know what they expect from you and how to get the guidance from them to get it done. And many times I find that when students feel stuck, it's because either a miscommunication or a lack of communication with their thesis supervisor. Once you have that clarity that you know what they expect, it is actually much easier to get it done. If you made it as far as graduate school, you know that you're smart enough to get the work done. You're motivated enough. You just need some guidance and some clarity on what it is that you need to do. And then finally, I have some productivity strategies in this book as well, in addition to the ones that I mentioned here, that are really going to help you to feel more motivated about your project, get more focused, and really work towards that finished thesis. Okay, question from Anne. How do priorities differ from a to-do list? So a to-do list would refer to the actions. Let me go back to that slide here. Maybe that will be helpful. Where did I have that slide here? Okay. So I hope you can see the slide here. Maybe actually this one over here. How does a priority differ from a to-do list? So the priority would be a project, and the project would be more the result that you want to accomplish. So maybe your priority is to finish writing a part of your manuscript. That's a project. Now your to-do list would be most similar to the list of actions that you need to do. So it's not that you need to throw away this whole idea of a to-do list completely. That's not the point here. The point is that now you're grouping together the actions that you need to take according to the projects that are priorities. So if you define your top 3 priorities for each day, then for those priorities, yes, you do need to write down the actions that will help you to move that project forward. So that's what would be most similar to a to-do list. But you didn't start out with a to-do list. You started out with the project, thinking big instead of getting caught in the minutia of your to-do list. Okay, question from Gary. How long should a to-do list be? Enough for a day, week, or goals? So I actually... What's most similar, I don't have a real to-do list. If I did, I wouldn't be able to do all the things that I do. I do operate from this paradigm that I showed you today, where I list the projects that are important for me. And I have a weekly plan. What are the things that I need to get done in a week? But those are more big results. So I only create a to-do list, so to speak, for each day individually. I don't create a to-do list for a whole week. So I create some big overall goals for the whole week. And then the evening before, I plan my next day. And that's when I write down the actions that I need to do to move that project forward. And I've taught this technique to many graduate students, and it really simplifies your life because it combines the advantages of thinking about what are the results that you want to accomplish in the week. So it helps you to think big, but it also helps you to break down into manageable parts what you need to get done the next day and where it is that you need to get started. And it gives you that flexibility to move your action list around during the day. So I hope that helps, Gary. Mariana says, how do you set your number 1 priority if you're working on 2 projects simultaneously? So the number 1 priority, it can depend upon the deadline. So if one is more urgent than another, then that's where I would start. If they both have equal urgency, so to speak, then you need to decide whether is one of the projects such that you just want to get it over with. Many times with writing, if that's one of your projects is writing, then many students just want to get that over with. So they just do that at the beginning of the day, and then they move on to project 2 later in the day. So it depends on your workflow, but what I don't recommend is that you work on the 2 in parallel. switching back and forth between the other. So if you can, it is better to spend either a half a day or a whole day focusing on one project, and then on the other project the next day, or cut your day in half, then going back and forth between the two projects, because that's similar to multitasking, and that's what can really tire you out. So I hope that answers your question, Mariana. Usually one project is more urgent than another, but if you're not sure, then sometimes getting some insights from your supervisor may help, because they may know things that you don't, for why one project may need to get done faster than the other. So I'm going to take another quick water break here. Just hang out for another couple of minutes, see if anybody had any questions. And if you're still on the line, I'd like to thank you again for organizing this event. It is really great to have such a fantastic turnout. And as you've seen, many people are struggling with the same types of issues. So when we have a lot of students in these events, that's when you can really have a good Q&A session, because you see that you're not the only one struggling with these issues. That alone can really help you to feel more confident, because if other people are struggling with the same types of issues and they are able to resolve it, then probably there's a way for you to resolve it as well. So just knowing that you're not alone can be a big help. So if you missed part of this presentation, there will be a replay, but it will only be available for a limited time. So make sure that you listen to it as soon as you get the email, which should be later today. And if you haven't had the chance to download the ebook, the link is finishyourthesis.com/ebook. So I'd like to thank you all for being so engaged, for sharing your questions. If you have any other questions, I'm going to type in my email address over here. So I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for being here. I wish you all the best, and I look forward to seeing you at one of my future webinars.